It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning, Ann Gearity. Shortly after I moved back to Minnesota in 1994, I can't believe that, it was that long ago, I was introduced to this new, at that time, still emerging field of infant and early childhood mental health. And I was funded by the Department of Education to do a project looking at the feasibility of developing some structures in Minnesota to assist us across disciplines in supporting kids with social, emotional, and mental health needs, and their parents and family members. And one of the first people that I was referred to, because I was new to the state, or newly returned to the state, was Ann Gearity, in addition to Jolene Pearson, who's also here, of course. And they became great resources for me. Ann has been a role model ever since, and I have so appreciated being a colleague of hers. In addition to the roles that are identified in the little blurb in your registration packet, Ann's Developmental Repair model is the basis for our online course supporting stressed young children with relationship-based teaching, And she's just been such a great resource throughout the years for me and many others in our state. In thinking about Ann and her work, two words came to mind: passion and compassion. And I think that also Ann embodies a great sense of creativity and a sense of humor, which are both really important in our work. And lastly, and this is important for our field, Ann is a collaborator and she's inclusive. She really honors the expertise that all of us in our different disciplines bring to the work with early childhood, supporting kids and their families. And she's our enthusiastic partner in all of our work. So please welcome Ann Gearity.
Okay, now let's see if we can do this. Okay, we did it. The hardest is done. All right, I'm delighted to be here, and I always want to claim this. My professional career actually started in early childhood special ed. I was hired in 1975 to work for Minneapolis schools. It was then a Bureau for the Education of the Handicapped demonstration program. And it was working with children with hearing impairments because there had been a measles epidemic. And they were anticipating Federal Law 94-142, so they were increasing staff. And I got hired as a social worker. I didn't know anything about young children at the time. I had just moved to Minnesota and I had a toddler. So I came in with that confidence. Which was not a lot. And I'm incredibly grateful because it really set my career trajectory. And I always say to my graduate students, if you know young children, you can help anyone. But you have to understand young children. So I'm delighted to be here with you today. And I've been asked to talk about what I'm going to call what constitutes kindness and why do we lose it. And hopefully we'll, I want to set my timer. There I go. Okay. So at this workshop in the next 2 days, you will be taking courses that help you consider early childhood education and the role of early childhood education in helping children access school, but also start to engage in this process of learning. And then consider how we do this role most effectively. As with every discipline, our research is changing our functioning. And the more we understand about development, the more we understand about how children learn, the more we change and modify our approaches. So that's why you're here. I want to talk about kindness today. And so I always want to start by defining the word. Kindness actually showed up in our language around the 15th century. So it's been around a long time. It's the quality of being kind, gentle, or considerate. There are many synonyms for kindness: benevolence, warmth, tenderness, care, humanity, sympathy, compassion, understanding, affection. So the question we want to ask, is kindness a choice? Do I act kind because I want to, or is this a necessary state of mind that must be available to children so that they can feel safe at school? And if this is a mandate, then what must happen to assure kindness prevails? Now, I'm sure you're thinking about, why am I talking about kindness? That's why we come into this work. Of course I want to be kind. But I have to tell you, in my 41 years of career, work with children and their families in schools, in other institutions, I've seen a lot of not kindness. I see a lot of kindness, kind of the spoken word kindness, but not a lot of actions that always support that kindness. So that's what we want to talk about today. My premise this morning is that kindness and positive emotions are at the core of early education practice and must be consciously and intentionally maintained for our work to be effective, especially when we are working with at-risk children. All right? So that's what I'm going to argue today, and we'll see what you think. So why kindness? Oh, no. You missed my slides. Oh, dear. All right, here we go. Is it up? Okay. What ones did you miss? Did you miss that premise? All right, there's the premise. All right? They'll be posted, so don't take notes. Just listen. They're all going to be posted. So why kindness? So we have to really think about why this idea of kindness becomes so essential. And the first thing that we have to talk about is kindness is essentially because of the vulnerability of very young children. We all work with children under 5. We know that the learning styles of children under 5 start with sensory motor learning, and we know that children move to pre-operational thinking or magical thinking. In the face of aggression, meanness, hostility, children make sense of that, not as this person is different, but there's something wrong with me, or I'm threatened. Young children really operate in a world where safety and threat is still the dominant idea in their mind. So with young children, we don't have a lot of discretionary functioning. You can be mean to an older child, and they can have the capacity, and many of you remember, oh, that teacher is mean. Oh, that person is crabby. Young children don't do that. The second reason that we have to think about kindness is because of the emerging brain research. We've all been terribly interested in this move that we've experienced. 1990s was the decade of the brain. Luckily, it didn't stop. The more we learn about the brain, the more we're fascinated by the diversity of our learning styles, but also the complexity of how we take in information and put it back out. We now know that it is much easier to stay open and interested to the world when positive emotion dominates. And that negative emotion, in fact, shuts down the brain and shuts down the learning process. The more threatened the person is, the more unable they're able to access new information. They're often able to go back to survival information, but not to expand their lens. The third thing we know about kindness is that early childhood is committed to influencing children's attitudes about school. There's a lot of work now about grit and tenacity as being core to children's ability to learn. It's not just how much you can take in, but how you stay in the process as an active learner. And we know that when children feel frightened about school, humiliated about school, scared to be at school, their learning decreases. We are creating the attitudes about school as we work. And because we're in early childhood special ed, we're often working with children who will, by their disability, find school more challenging than their peers. So the attitudes about how they go to school and what they think about learning is critically part of our mandate. The fourth thing that we have to think about is diverse cultural perceptions. Right? We're much more aware that different cultural experiences color how children read and understand interactions. We also know that in a community that has predominantly Caucasian teachers, that we're having children of color come and not have models that look like them, sound like them, act like them. And kindness becomes a bridge between cultures that we have to attend to. The last reason why kindness is so important is because it makes us feel better, right? When we're kind, kindness is returned. And we know that a community where kindness dominates often increases motivation and decreases burnout. So for our own sakes, we want to have this idea of kindness so that we don't tire of our work. All right, this is a quote from an article that was recently in the New York Times by a young neuroscience researcher. It is no coincidence that emotions feel so good. The hormones released when you're happy, in love, and feeling appreciated all help regulate your heartbeat into a coherent pattern. The fixed beating sets a rhythm for the rest of your body so that all other homeostatic mechanisms are carried out in sync. So when we talk about regulation, a very important term that I'm sure you'll hear a lot about this 2 days, we're really starting with this homeostatic regulation that happens in your body. And positive emotions help that regulation happen. Dysregulation, or feeling out of sync with my body, creates an experience of distress that compromises my learning. So feeling good helps. We also want to think about bi-directional regulation. So bi-directional regulation is what we often talk about. I use a figure 8, an infinity sign. And what we know about parents and children now is that when a parent feels regulated, the child benefits from that experience and starts to gain a capacity for regulating myself. Here's the secret. When the child feels dysregulated, what do you think happens to the parent? They get dysregulated. So the baby sleeps through the night and you feel like, whoa, I'm a great parent. And the baby stops sleeping through the night and is distressed, and we're pushed back to, oh, what am I doing wrong? So this idea of bi-regulation is really critical. Sometimes we call it mutual regulation. And we now know that parent or adults provide regulatory support that augments cohesion for both. So in the classroom, when you feel regulated, your students will have a greater sense of being able to be regulated themselves. And when you feel dysregulated, the classroom will fall apart. Anyone notice that? So we affect each other. And this ability to affect each other is really at the core of what we're calling social subjectivity or intersubjectivity. That we really have, almost on a twilight zone level of consciousness, we affect each other, right? And it's not just with our language or our looks. It's even deeper. It's almost on a cellular level. We impact each other's regulation. And when we can maintain a bi-directional balance that says, okay, we're doing it, there's greater chance that regulation is maintained. Oops, went too far. All right, so then we have to think about the impact of stress. Because I said kindness is important for all children, but it's critical for distressed children. And certainly in the last decade, more and more research has been done about stress. So we want to start out very quickly and remind ourselves that stress is necessary and inevitable. There's nobody who doesn't have stress. Anybody not have stress this morning? I caused poor Deb a lot of stress because Mary and I drove up this morning and we kind of drove slowly. Poor Deb. We didn't mean it. So stress happens. It's just part of life. And in fact, stress is necessary because if you don't feel stress, you don't learn something new. Right? If you're totally satisfied, you don't have that desire to learn. So we need stress. We know that adults help keep stress tolerable for children. So tolerable stress is described as enough to turn on your brain, right, with enough resources so that you can do the task, and for children, enough adult support so that you stay in the process. All right? So very important, enough stress that you have to turn on your brain. So we don't want children to be bored. Right? Bored is not good for your body. You've got to have stimulation. But enough resources so that you don't get overwhelmed by the stimulation. So asking children to manage more than they are able can really overwhelm them. So tolerable stress is that finding that sweet spot where the 2 or 3-year-old can do it. And then the third is enough adult support so that they maintain that idea of I did it. All right? I did it. I did it. There's nothing as wonderful as watching a 3 or 4-year-old say, I did it. Right? They stand on the steps and they jump down and they raise their arms like Olympic champions and they said, I did it. And the response is, you did, because they've been able to master the stress into new learning. Right? So this is very important for educators because we're all about learning. And that's why stress is important. Young children have to deal with many sources of stress. So there's stress from the outside, environmental challenges. There's stress from the inside. Right? Development causes stress. Anyone living with an almost walking infant? You know, and they stand up in the middle of the night, right, in the crib, crying because they don't know how to get down yet. Right? They know how to get up, they don't know how to get down. You can see that their body is finding the next task. So stress also comes from inside. The body can generate stress. And the third area of stress is relationship expectations. And relationship expectations and interactions are a big source of stress for preschool children, toddlers and preschools, because they're trying to move from that blissful state of infancy, right, where everything happens for them, to this beginning interactive state of toddler and preschool where they've got to figure out what to do and figure out what they're not supposed to do. So stress increases in the preschool years because they're trying to socialize to the larger community. And that's stressful because they can't always figure out our rules. Toxic stress is what we're interested in. All right? Tolerable stress is not a bad thing. We're not talking about developing models that make children stress-free. But toxic stress, we know, is biologically as well as psychologically devastating. There's just a report in the New York Times this weekend about a series of small studies that are starting to demonstrate that post-traumatic stress disorder is probably a physical malady. It's not in your head, it's in your body, because toxic stress affects the body. Toxic stress is best described as too much for too long with too little help. All right? Too much. So the brain is not turned on, it's overwhelmed. For too long. So whatever resources the child had to meet the tasks are depleted. And without enough adult help means that the child isn't supplemented in their efforts and in fact abandoned to the feelings of danger. Now, this too little adult help is not always intentional abandonment, but the child's physiological experience is, I can't do it and no one's helping me. Children exposed to toxic stress cannot manage and often become overwhelmed. And this overwhelmed sense expresses itself through symptoms, and in young children, symptoms are often behaviors. So we often see children's behaviors becoming maladaptive for their social context when they feel too stressed and don't feel help. Now, the problem with toxic stress is that once you experience it in your body, it's not that you can shake it off, right? We're not like the zebras who shake off their adrenaline surges. We carry it. So often we carry it into new situations. Right? Without kind mediation, what happens then to children's bodies? So this is just a little bit of information we'll use over our weekend. We know that we have two nervous systems. One's called the sympathetic nervous system, and the other is called the parasympathetic nervous system. So when there's toxic stress, what happens in a child's body, and again, it's not specific to the situation. They carry it in their body, so often they bring it with them when they go into new situations. And what we see is that their nervous system activates a fight or flight reaction. When children perceive threat, even when none exists in the immediate moment, their internal experience is of fear, danger, and a desire for survival. Now, some of you might have very challenged and challenging little kiddos who, when they get distressed, look like they are in a fight panic, right? Sometimes we even describe that their faces can look transformed as they act like they're just in a corner and they're fighting for their lives. And that's what the sympathetic nervous system does when it's overloaded. It goes to fight for my life. Right? Now, the parasympathetic nervous system, which is a parallel system, has a slightly different response. What happens in the parasympathetic nervous system is that everything slows down, all right, in the face of rejection or losing acceptance. Your heart rate slows down, things slow down. So sometimes we can see children who are in this fight, flight, but also slowing down dilemma, and we come up with this assumption, oh, he's doing it on purpose. Right? He's not doing it on purpose. He's really in a slowed down state where his primary awareness of feeling is heartbreak and despair. So you have this kind of combination that's going on of a desperate fear and a heartbreak and despair. And that often renders children unable to stay engaged with us and unable to get to solutions or choices as we expect. Now, when arousal is quiet, remember fight, flight. Some children go into flight, and what flight is I just leave the situation. We call it dissociating. I go out of the danger in my mind, and I often can look quite calm. So when arousal is calm, adults usually can remain kind. Children signal they're upset and are often more open to soothing because the sympathetic and the parasympathetic are kind of matching up. They're in a quieter space, right? So heartbreak is easier to address when you're not getting punched, right? So quiet distress evokes calmer responses, and we're often better at helping these children. When stress arousal is loud, right, it's much harder. Children often signal distress, but often trigger in us. Remember the bi-directional regulation? So even though the child is trying to signal distress, often what our bodies, because we have a sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system as well, and we are vulnerable to the reactions of other people. Even though they're this high, they still activate us, all right? Our cognitive self is slower to react, much slower than our more primitive brain messages. So although they signal distress, they often trigger anger, fear, disdain, dismissal in others. So we want to ask ourselves, why? Why does that happen? Anyone have a thought? You want to try? Why does that happen? Because we get scared too. And even though we know we're not supposed to be scared of children, or we know that there's no need to be scared of children, we get scared. Now, again, I want to ask those of you who are parents, you know, I don't know about you, but did you ever yell at your kid too much? And then you think, why am I doing this? Because I got scared, all right? So fear so motivates our reactivity. And even though I know that I'm the adult, this can have an impact on me. Intensity of emotion reminds all of us of our own vulnerability and our own biases about how children should feel and behave. When there is existing estrangement, it is hard not to become reactive and seem mean. All right? Now, this idea of existing estrangement is really important because we're going to come back to this in a few minutes when we talk about culture and differences. So the children who are loud are much harder for us to stay in that calm place because we get activated too. So this is the dilemma for all of us. All right, we talk about our brains. This is a very simplistic statement, so forgive me. But when you boil it all down, the same parts of our brains that need to be engaged for learning are often compromised by fear. All right, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex that are critical for learning are turned off or occupied when fear dominates. So that's why we can't learn when we're fearful, right? And even when I don't intend to make someone fearful, if I make you feel fearful, you will defend. You will defend. Your mind will go into a process that's not interested in open, but is often shut down. So again, think of your own lives and think of a supervisor or colleague who really feels threatening to you. And when someone criticizes you and you don't have that feeling of safety, you often will either shut down or start arguing back why you're right and she's wrong. What's happening is that your brain is in a more fear-dominated place where you're trying to maintain your own homeostasis rather than an open place that can say, isn't that interesting? I never thought of that before. What a helpful comment. Huh? Right? Right? So I want us to see we're all in this dilemma. Now, most of us go back and forth between the fear brain and the learning brain with somewhat comfortable fluidity and flexibility. When children have experienced toxic stress, when any of us have experienced toxic stress, that fluidity and flexibility diminishes, and we get more and more rigid because we get more and more preoccupied with trying not to feel fear. So because this is an evidence-based workshop, I wanted to show you that this is not an original idea. And in fact, many of the evidence-based programs that are really gaining momentum and importance have kindness embedded in them. Circle of Security. How many of you are aware of Circle of Security? So Circle of Security is an evidence-based model that works with very at-risk children and their parents. And their mantra is bigger, the adults should be bigger, stronger, wiser, kind. All right? They have a caution, whenever possible, follow the child's lead. Whenever necessary, take charge, but take charge kindly. The outcome of Social Security is improved parent-child security and improved developmental outcomes, same as education. The second one is ABC, Attachment Biobehavioral Catch-Up. It's developed by Mary Dozier. Again, it's a program that's being used in infant mental health, working with parents and foster parents of very at-risk children. When you work in ABC, you're instructed to have 3 comments. So you go on a home visit, and there are 3 things that you can talk about. You can comment when the parent is nurturing. You can comment when the parent follows the child's lead. And you comment when the parent shows delight. Isn't that lovely? Delight. I love that, delight. All right? So embedded in this is, again, a kindness towards the child in understanding that if the child feels your positive emotion, they will be more likely to trust you and use you, and their development will increase. The third is my own developmental repair. So some of you will join me today. Developmental repair was a model that we developed at Washburn Center. We started in 1996, and we faced exactly what you faced. We had young children who were often in special ed, EBD programming, preschool and school age, who had very, very, very at-risk and trauma histories, who were getting constantly suspended and excluded from community schools and placements because they acted badly. And yet when we went into the literature and looked at attachment and trauma and stress, we could see that these were children who were quite developmentally delayed in their capacity to maintain self-regulation, which included emotion regulation and behavior regulation. Around the time that I was doing this, I'm proud to tell you that I wrote a letter to the Minnesota Department of Education suggesting that they change the EBD label to a developmental disorder of social emotional learning, and nobody wrote back. Their loss. Huh? So what we did in developmental repair is we said we had to create a kind group for these children. They were so busy they were so constantly being in peer groups where they were shunned, excluded, or bullied, or bullying. So we had to create a kind group. We had to repair the group so it became a developmentally appropriate group. We had to join kindly, starting with the child's perspective, and then we had to use words, because these were not babies, to offer words that permit the child to experience safety and kindness. Our goals are similar to the other two programs, but our children are slightly older, so we're really looking to repair adult-child interactions, so we're looking at ourselves and teachers, and to improve developmental outcomes so that children can start to learn again. So what I'm wanting you to see is that this idea of kindness and positive emotion is embedded in these evidence-based models because it allows children to move out of danger to safety. It allows children to start to think about the adults in their life as helping them rather than harming them, and it increases their ability to learn. Now, before I go to why kindness is hard, many of you have been trained in more behavioral models of behavior management, which work really, really well for well-loved children. Can I say that again? They work really, really well for well-loved children. They work really, really well for children who have not had to deal with a lot of adversity and toxic stress. Because at the core of behavior management, which we also call contingency reinforcement, is the first contingency, which is when I am distressed, you will help me. Right? And if that contingency is not reliably in place, you can't get to the second contingency, which is when I explore, you will help me not go too far. Right? You will help me negotiate my way back, whether it's from the living room or from a power struggle that's way overwhelming. And it isn't until those two contingencies are securely in the child's learning that they can move to the subsequent contingencies, such as make good choices. Make good choices is totally based on their earlier experiences of feeling safe. So again, the contingency reinforcement models are really good if children already learned how to use and regulate themselves. But if for many, many, many reasons, family reasons, historical trauma reasons, family poverty and distress reasons, neurobiological reasons, this has not been within the child's mastery, then we're asking them to learn something they don't know how to do. And if we are harsh, they can't learn it. So why is kindness hard? And what can we do to stay hard? So we want to start with this idea that children need adult kindness to stay in balance. It's just a given. Right? I would argue all children need adult kindness. I'd even argue all of us need kindness. But especially for the preschool years, we have to say that children need adult kindness to stay in balance. And balance is what we want, because if they're out of balance, they can't learn. It is very easy to stay kind when children signal affection and receive affection easily. Easy, right? It's easy to stay kind when children appreciate help. It's very easy to stay kind when children act in reciprocal ways or children show positive emotions. Oh, you're so nice to me. Brings kindness back. Easy. And it's very easy to be kind to children who show who seem innately generous to their peers. Those children naturally pull for kindness. It's harder to stay kind when children appear distant or resist engagement. It's harder to stay kind when children recoil from help or confuse adults. And this is an important one. In developmental repair, we talk about our first job is to join children until they hire us. Right? And that idea of they have to hire me, right? It's not just I saying, I'm the teacher, and you have to listen to me. It really is that they have to hire me into this reciprocal bi-directional regulation so I know I'm important. Because most of the time, children follow us because they want to please us. So it's very hard when children can't hire me or confuse me because of their fear and uncertainty. It's very hard to stay kind when children act selfishly, manipulatively, or act uncooperative. Excuse me. I love the word manipulative in preschool because early in my career, one of your colleagues helped me see that Legos are the penultimate manipulative, right? It just means that you move around the parts. And a lot of children are described by us as manipulative because we have a perception of what they're supposed to be doing. And they have a different perception, and they're moving the parts around differently, but we impose judgment. It's hard to be kind when children display negative emotions, and it's really hard to be kind to children who disrupt the group. And it's really hard to be kind when adults lose track of development. It's very hard to stay kind when you've got a single-minded, linear model of development. It was really important in the late 90s when developmental researchers told us that, in fact, it's quite normal for development to go back and forth. In fact, we all go back and forth. So a lot of children come to us on Monday and they're back, and by Thursday they're forth. And on Monday, they're back again. Because development is about back and forth learning. And when you lose track of development, it's hard to stay kind. It's also hard to stay kind when adults lose interest in children's real experiences, when adults are so stressed that they forget that children are individuals with different experiences and different needs. It's very hard when adults privilege needs of some children over others. And those of you who work with challenging behavioral kids struggle with this all the time, where the classroom teacher's response is, why should I be patient with him when he's affecting the experience of others? Right? Or get this kid out of my classroom because he's ruining the preschool experience of the rest of the children. This is violating the very core of education, which is everyone belongs. And the very core of group experience, which is we all learn how to help one another. One of the best things that I try to help teachers learn to do, even in the elementary grades, is to say, John is having a hard time today. Anyone have any ideas about how we can help? Right? Which brings in that feeling of belonging. It's very hard for teachers or adults to stay kind when they feel rushed, pressured, or blamed. And this remains one of the challenges of education, at least in the districts I go to. If we're not blaming the kids, we're blaming the teachers. We got to get out of the blame, and we got to get interested. And it's very hard to be kind when adults feel personally stressed and have too little support. It's very hard to stay kind. So a lot of times I think our acts of not kindness are not because we intend them, but because we're spent. So this is my favorite cartoon. Some of you have seen it before because I use it for everything. I have to spend quality time with my adults or they'll become dysfunctional. And that's exactly the bi-directional dilemma, right? If I don't feel effective, then I'm not going to function very well with children. And we all know this as parents. Underneath that adults is actually parents. The less time you spend with the kids, your own kids, the more out of sync you get. So the same thing for our children. All right, so I want to redefine kindness for us in an operational way. I'm going to suggest that kindness is an affective signal of safety. The reason that we need to use kindness is because I signal safety. Even when I get angry at a child, I'll often say, I am so mad right now. Okay, let's think about what we can do. And as soon as I flip it to the we, I'm signaling kindness. And you know what happens? My mad goes away. As soon as I say, okay, let's figure out what we can do. All right, let's try and fix it. All right, let me think about this. Let's do it together. I'm able to move into kindness because I want to signal safety. Kindness also indicates respect, interest, and willingness to join the child. And I'll come back, hold on to that idea of joining. Kindness is a boost to children's motivation and stamina to learn something new. Remember, toxic, tolerable stress, adult mediation. Kindness is your way of saying, come on, come on, come on, you can do it. And it mediates meanness that children cannot metabolize. Kindness does not preclude expectations, disapproval, or even consequences, but these must be combined with support that is developmentally appropriate and therefore kind. So this is not a model that says, sweet, 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 lovey, lovey, lovey. I get mad at kids all the time. But I mediate it with the second response of kindness so that they can take me in, which is what we really talk about as good parent capacity. You don't stay mad at your kid longer than is useful for him so that he can stay connected to you and keep moving forward. So kindness, or disposition for kindness, is more than a virtue. It really is an active, intentional state of mind or foundational attitude that takes practice and requires knowledge, skill, and support. I don't think we learn this in graduate school. I think we learn this in the field. We learn it from doing it. We learn it from having colleagues. We learn it from having good supervision. We have to practice it. It's something that I have to think about every day. I lose it, and I have to get it back. The purpose of the disposition for kindness, in my mind, is to help the child move forward towards continuing development and new learning, number one, and to reduce and repair obstacles to moving ahead. So I'm always thinking when I'm working with children about how do we go forward? How do we go forward? Now, this is a very different psychological model than many of us are used to, because in the past, we have privileged the past. Why did you do that? Right? Why did you do that? Why did you do that? Now, what do you think is happening in the kid's mind when you say, why did you do that? Are they sitting there philosophically thinking, I wonder why I did that? Right? Are they coming up with elaborate explanations about their own perceptual validity? No, they're in fear. And so they say to you, I don't know. And then we get mad at them. Right? And we, as if, rather than saying, I saw what happened, let's figure out what you can learn so next time it works better. Or I saw it, that didn't work. Whoa, what else can we do? So this idea of always going back into the past is really embedded in some of our old psychology models because we can't fix the past. I can't do anything about the past. Even in restorative justice models, what I'm fixing is the present and the future. So we want to use present and future language because it's moving children forward. And because it's moving them forward, they don't have to be scared. All right? Being told, I can help you fix this, is a very different physiological response than, why did you do that? Right? And for young children, that's the learning we want to help them for. So when we think of kindness, there are some tools that we really want to be aware of, practice, and share with each other. The first is you have to be aware of stress. Stress is real. How many of you are aware of the ACEs study? Many of you are. The ACEs study has now been replicated nationally and international. This is the effect of adverse childhood experiences. There's just undeniable evidence that when there is an accumulation of adverse childhood experiences, that this affects your subsequent learning, adaptation, health, and welfare. right? Physiologically as well as psychologically, adults with excessive childhood experiences that are adverse fare worse. So we have to pay attention to stress. We have to appreciate stress. We have to mediate stress. We have to especially understand stress reactivity when stress is toxic. We have to believe that toxic stress alters perception and memory. Right? This is one of the interesting things. When you've been stressed, you see the world differently. When you're in a fear state, you see fear. We know children who, this is research done at the University of Wisconsin, who when shown pictures on a computer of faces, they quickly identify that the face is a person, and they always identify the person as mad. Even when the face is bored, interested, confused, puzzled, sad, they see mad. So their brains have been altered to react to danger as the primary and privileged response. We need to pay attention to our own stress and need for support. And we need to remember that young children feel others' stress acutely, especially when it's not mediated with words. When I first started this work, I had a case of a young child, 11-month-old, who witnessed her father murdering her mother. And at the time, the literature said, children don't remember until they can have words. Children don't remember until 4 or 5. Now, simultaneous, there was a first study, actually out of the University of Minnesota, that indicated that 6-month-olds remember. And we now know, 20 years later, that in fact, young children without language feel and remember acutely stress responses. They just don't have the words. And because they don't have the words, they absorb it as their own. So the second is remember development. Development can be continual, but it's always incremental. And be aware of developmental qualities that describe what may be happening inside the child. So consider that young children don't always behave intentionally. Do you? Huh? That many young children behave reactively or habitually because they're learning. And so development gives us wonderful openings to this idea of learning. Radiolab this Saturday had a great section on how young children understand right from wrong. And it was really beautifully done, using research and describing that even by 4, they may know it's wrong, but they know it's wrong in one part of their brain, but they're still learning in all the other parts of their brain. So we have to be open to developmental learning. Another one of my favorite cartoons I would share, but I'm not there developmentally. Pay attention to where the child is, not always where the child should be. One of the things I want educators to do is identify the behavior that they find infuriating and then ask themselves the question, what does this child need to learn and how can I help her learn it? Because then you're in the zone of development. Third, be in the present. I've said this already. Be interested in what's happening right now. Privilege the present and future over the past. Trust that the transactional energy in the present is much more important and effective than past learning is. You know, don't try to get kids to talk about what happened. For very distressed children, saying, what did you do and why did you do that, is like saying, go back into that burning building and tell me what it was like. They can't do it. It's too scary. So we have to keep them where they're safe and they're open to learning. This is not denying what happened. There's lots of ways that we can say, you know, you really did scare this children, or you did hurt. I have a real quick example. This is actually a kindergartner, but it fits. So George came to me. George was in trouble because everyone said George hit Henry. Everyone agreed George hit Henry. The playground people, the teachers. George's mother was mortified. George was not an aggressive kid. She was so embarrassed. Coincidentally, I was seeing him for anxiety. And he came in, and he was just, his face was so tight. And he said, I didn't hit Henry, I didn't. And his mother was even more embarrassed. And so I said, tell me about Henry. Oh, Henry was this big kid. And Henry crashed into everyone. And he saw Henry coming at him. Right? Are you already thinking about what's going on in George's mind? So I said, so then what happened? He says, I don't know. And his mother said, George, you hit Henry. I didn't hit Henry. I didn't hit Henry. Did you hear the tightness? So finally we quieted it down, and I said, I think I figured it out. I think you saw Henry coming and you got scared, and I think your arm hit Henry. He said to me, that's right. My arm hit Henry. I said, yes, I think your arm was so scared your arm hit Henry. So then we both looked at his arm. And we decided that even though his arm had hit Henry, it was George's arm, so he had to be the boss of his arm, and he had to learn how to tell his arm not to hit Henry. Right? Now that's not hard. It's actually so enjoyable when you go into the child's experience and understand it so that you can kindly stay with that child's experience, and then you can help them move along. All right? They carry these things into your classroom. They carry recent family interactions. They carry stressful memories and fears. And they carry disappointments and negative expectations. And because they're in their mind, they dominate. Just as George's fear of Henry was larger than Henry's actions. That's what happens to all of us. So we have to be respectful of what they carry and curious. The fourth thing that you want to do is tell shared stories. Now, every single one of you use books. And the reason that children's books are so wonderful is not just because they're language development, but because they often tell stressful stories. When children feel that adults understand them, they have a greater capacity to join a shared story. So George and I had a shared story. Language narrative moves fear from a felt experience to a spoken experience, to a told experience, to a shared experience. And what happens when it's shared? It doesn't feel so bad. So when you share an experience, you feel the company of the other. This is why we call our friends when things are hard. And it's in developing those shared stories that children start to learn mastery, not only what happened to them, but the mastery of telling what happened can actually bring you relief. Shared stories in good company is at the heart of culture and social belonging. And we need to really work with children to help them tell their stories, these shared stories. And stress and repair narratives are at the core. So I just picked out two books. I was meant to scan. How many of you know this book? This is my new favorite book. I'll tell you why, quickly. So Pete the cat, for those of you who don't know, is a very groovy cat, very groovy. And he has this song, I love my white shoes, I love my white shoes. And he's very groovy. He's just not so smart. And so he's walking along, and he walks into a pile of strawberries. Oh, no. What color is his shoes? Red. Does he cry? Goodness, no. He just keeps singing his song, I love my red shoes, I love my red shoes. Now he walks into blueberries, he walks into mud. But the end of the book is that wonderful page, the moral of the story is just keep singing your song, and it's all good. The reason I love Pete the cat is because it captures that toddler preschool developmental task that's core to social emotional functioning, which is, oh, well. Right? Right? Don't we have to say, oh, well? Right? And we get these very stressed children who come in and they don't know how to stay, oh, well. Because inside everything feels so hard and dangerous. So the smallest disappointment feels like the world is coming apart. So Pete the Cat has been a great book to say to children, this is what we practice. Oh, things happen. Oh, we ran out of cookies. Oh, well. And it really helps. The other book that I love is Mr. Gumby's Outing. Mr. Gumby's Outing is one of the few books that talks about really repair. So they're all going to go on, it's a British book, so it's lovely. They're going on a river. They're going to ride on a raft. And Mr. Gumby says to the cow, you can come, but don't muck about. And he says to the cat, you can come, but don't chase the rabbit. And he says to the goat, you can come, but I can't remember what now. And he says to the children, you can come, but don't squabble. So what he's doing is he's identifying their essential element. And they all get on the river, and they all go down the raft, and guess what happens? Human nature and animal nature being what it is, the cow mucks about, the cat chases the rabbit, the dog does something, the children squabble. They all fall into the river. They swim to the shore, no tragedy. They walk across the field and dry off, and Mr. Gumby says, come for tea. There's this beautiful 2-page layout where they're all drinking tea. And then the last line of the book is, goodbye, says Mr. Gumby, come for a ride another day. Now, why do I love this book? It's in the future, right? We blew it, right? It didn't go well. We'll try it again tomorrow, right? That's where your shared story is. That didn't go well. Let's try it tomorrow. And that's where your learning goes. This is why so many of these books children love. They don't particularly love the highly instructive books. They don't love the books. Why were you mad? But they love the books that have the subtlety of message. And we love them too, right? So the last thing I want to highly recommend is grow your capacity for reflection. And you have Mary Harrison here and Christopher Watson, who are working extensively locally and nationally to build this idea of reflective practice. Many of you have done reflective practice in one form or the other. Adult reflective capacity is our ability to be aware of my own experience, my perceptions, feelings, ideas, intentions, needs, and also access and hold on to the child's experience. Right? This is what good parenting is about. This is what good early education is about. When I have a response, I have to be able to hold on to my response and have space for the other's response. Have space for what it was like for this child. To be reflective, we have to be interested in what's going on inside the child more than reacting to the child's behaviors, because that's how we can figure out what the child needs to learn. We must value the other's perspective. Adult capacity is so important because children cannot see our perspective if we don't see their perspective. That's probably the most important sentence in this whole talk. Children cannot see our perspective if we don't see theirs. So saying to them, I want you to do this, is not going to work unless they understand that I also understand them, unless they feel. We know that empathy is not taught. Empathy is acquired. The more empathy you get, the more empathy you give. The more kindness you get, the more kindness you give. It's, again, that transactional nature of our development. Social learning helps children bridge to shared experience that they recognize as safe and useful. So social learning in schools is really about building bridges that help children who don't feel safe because of disability, because of family stress, because of cultural differences, come into our setting, not because we're forcing them into our setting, but because we're helping them come in and make it all of our settings. It's not my classroom, it's our classroom. And when we can use our reflective capacity to recognize their needs, we do much better at naming their needs, identifying their needs, helping them learn to meet their needs, and become better and better at functioning and social participation. Helping distressed children requires acute adult reflective capacity, right? It's not, you're not going to learn how to help them in the textbooks. You're not going to learn how to help them from curriculum, because it has to start in a relational way. It has to be a felt experience. When stress arousal happens, they have to borrow our perceptions so that they can make sense of their own experience. That's what adult mediation is when it's effective, and that's what helps them move to learning and repair. So what we provide is not just mediation that's practiced, but mediation that's individually practiced. Individual educational planning, here it is. And unless we can really feel that child's need and help name it, we lose him in a repetitive way. So, the last thing is certainly to value emerging research and new ideas. We're living in a paradigm shift in education. Things are changing. When I first did a talk in education, I was invited to talk to a group of middle school staff. And I remember one of these kind of wise, cynical old guys who said, I've been teaching a long time. You're new to this, huh? And I said, yeah, because I was new and eager. And he said to me, you'll love education. It's the only system where Rip Van Winkle could wake up and say, just as I remember. That isn't going to be anymore, right? We cannot educate the way we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago. We cannot do it. Our world is changing. The skills that we need children to acquire is changing. I went to a first grade where there were 72 children in my class. It was in, post-war Long Island, and we walked down the hall like this so that we would be orderly. We were taught a lot of good things, but not useful skills for the 21st century. Education has to change, and we have to keep looking for better ways to understand what our task is. This is a book that was just published by Paul Tough. Many of you know Paul Tough's work. He wrote, I think it was How Are Children Successful? And he said that after the book, many, many educators called him up and said, this is great information, but what am I supposed to do with it? So this is a small book about things to do. I'm certainly not pushing this as the only book, but there's much out there, and I hope that in these 2 days, talking to each other, you will continue this conversation. How do we do this so that we're effective for all children, and how do we stay at our kindest best? Thank you.